You know, the more I read about history, the more I find myself being sucked into the extensive knowledge that we have about so many different parts of the world. And let me correct this here. And I think the parts that I am most familiar with are, of course, the parts that I'm going to start with, like America and the Western civilization, I guess is the phrase. But I'm also becoming increasingly more interested in Eastern culture in general, and Japan's history, I figured, is as good a place as any to start out with, and so I downloaded a little synopsis of Japan's early history from as early as 50,000 BCE, BC in the Paleolithic period. Early Japanese history is traditionally thought of in 5 major eras. The Paleolithic, 50,000 BC to 12,000 BC. Jomon, and of course, like any uncultured Westerner, I'm sure I will pronounce most of these wrong, so bear with me. Jomon, 11,000 BC to 300 BC. Yayo, 9,000 BC to 250 AD. Kofun, 300 AD to 552 AD. And Yamato periods. These are all different periods. The Yamato being from 552 AD to 710 AD. While dating these periods is complex, and the cultures in any case tended to overlap, it is clear that the early Japan underwent profound changes in each of these important periods. So the Paleolithic period, again from 50,000 BC to 12,000 BC, starts like so. The first human beings to inhabit the island we know as Japan appear to have been Stone Age hunters from Northeast Asia, traveling in small groups and using stone-tipped weapons. They followed herds of wild animals, including mammoths, elephants, and deer, across land bridges to Japan that had formed when the seas receded during the Ice Ages. While many believe that they came earlier, we know for certain that these hunters arrived in Japan as at least as early as 35,000 BC. Wow. I had no idea it was that early. That's amazing. While the tools prior to that time are so crude that there is some debate over whether they were made by humans, surviving late Paleolithic artifacts include finely made blade tools, similar to groups in Siberia and the rest of Eurasia, and axes made from ground stone. Since no pottery has yet been discovered, on the other hand, the Paleolithic period in Japan is also sometimes referred to as the pre-ceramic or Sendoki period. This helps distinguish its inhabitants from those of the following eras. Research in this period has been complicated by the fact that an amateur archaeologist named Fujimura Shinichi was caught salting, as they say, various sites with alleged very old Paleolithic artifacts. Fujimura's crime reflected not only his own desire to be famous, but also a Japanese fascination with the origins and of the Japanese people and Japanese society. In Japan, the emphasis on the older the better, especially if Japanese origins in any field predate Chinese or Korean developments. Fujimura's discoveries thus fueled a rapidly developing early Paleolithic boom that sold newspapers and books and created a self-satisfied stir among ordinary people. All this helps to explain why neither the media at first nor archaeological specialists saw through the fraud. In perpetrating his fraud, in other words, Fujimura was catering to the sense of the Japanese narcissism and exceptionalism called the Nihonjin Ron, that is, not very far beneath the surface of contemporary Japanese public opinion. And you know, I would imagine that's pretty ubiquitous. Local perspective, you know, in-group preference, if you will, because, of course, everybody, I'm reading this well, I say reading, I'm listening to this fascinating book called The Lucifer Principle by Howard Bloom, and about a quarter of the way through it right now, and it is so far tying from all ends of the animal world, including humans and different groups of humans, the theory that it's tying together the theory from all those different aspects of in-group selection and its possible propagation through time and history, and how despite another human or another chimpanzee or another amoeba, bacteria, or sea anemone, or take your phylogenetic pick, those instincts to automatically group other strangers into the group of the potentially destructive and I guess as the enemy is a way I was trying to paint that picture. My brush strokes aren't quite as fine at this hour of the day, but that painting in general is one I hadn't really thought of directly before or heard about, and it seems to make sense that that's one of the driving forces throughout potentially all of history, is that we have an instinct that is right down to the individual. You know, you look at strangers as potential threats to your ego and your safety and your future gains within any maybe not political necessarily, but any hierarchy you may be involved in. And I think it's revealing that it is made explicit here in this article, the attempt of a particular amateur archaeologist to tap into the vein of perhaps tacit, unspoken, mainstream thought and perspective, glorifying perspective, self-glorifying perspective on one's society, particularly Japan here, as being essentially just a better civilization than those around it. And I think it might have evolutionarily been very useful to be able to discern who is your kin or your friend if your group is larger than just your family. But perhaps nowadays, that needs to be addressed. So anyways, that was a small digression there, but I suppose I just mentioned that to bring up the point of my previous fallacy years ago, or maybe almost 2 years now probably, of making the mistake with my World War II videos of grabbing from the internet a source about the synopsis of World War II, and I think it was World War I is what the article mainly addressed. And as far as the origins of it, it was heavily, actually subtly, it was subtly anti-Semitic, and although very accurate factually as far as some of the events, especially the events that occurred, such as main political movements and war tactics and outcomes, obviously, it had an underlying tone of anti-Semitic or pro-Semitic conspiracy to essentially garner all the political power and have much political opinion and say and sway across all the major national military powers of that era. And that is it's something that certainly I did not intend to promote by reading that article. So I made an apology when it dawned on me halfway through it to I made a point to distance my personal views from the article upon which I was basing my videos. So anyways, I just wanted to make sure I prefaced that I'm basing this off an article. I'm mostly reading it, and in case it's any potentially nationalistic, overly group selective in its depiction of history in general as a term. I think my vague knowledge about some of the atrocities that occurred during the World War II years and the Cultural Revolution during the time of Mao Zedong. And, well, actually, I'm so ill-informed about that, I can't really speak too much, but I just know there is a deep, historically based, historically valid thread of animosity and disdain for one another between China and Japan. And it came to some very animalistic and inhumane, to say the least, treatment of one another in certain periods, and especially during the 20th century. So let's continue. I apologize for that digression, and maybe I will make a video on that. That came from the book, a book called The Rape of Nanking that I didn't read. I haven't read. Maybe I should before I go on talking about it, but I've heard a couple hours of discussion and reviews of it that were very interesting, to treat it lightly. But so that was I just wanted to, I suppose, paint a context of my topic that we're currently discussing right now, reading. So we said, in perpetuating his fraud, in other words, Fujimura was catering to the sense of Japanese narcissism and exceptionalism that is not very far beneath the surface of contemporary Japanese public opinion, which I have no personal reference to be able to affirm or deny that claim. But that ends the section on the Paleolithic period, and that ended at 12,000 BC. Now we're going to pick up the Jomon period. And this period begins at 11,000 BC and goes up to the year 300 BC. Okay, so about 20,000 years ago, the world's fourth and most recent ice age ended. As the climate warmed, the polar ice caps melted and the sea levels rose. The land bridges that had provided walkways for such Paleolithic inhabitants of Japan as giant woolly mammoths, deer, and humans were submerged for the final time. For now, at least. The islands of Honshu and Hokkaido were again separated, and Japan was once more isolated geographically. As Japan became hotter, reaching its peak about 3000 BC, animals such as the woolly mammoth that had traditionally been hunted died out. but fortunately for other plants and animals, they did better. And new, more sophisticated civilization began to emerge. This new stage in Japanese history is known as the Jomon, or literally chord pattern period, because it is characterized by the appearance of earthenware pottery that often decorated with marks and swirling designs impressed by sticks, bamboo, vines, or rope. The pots were fired in open pits at fairly low temperatures, and thousands of different pots have been found, but the earliest ones, dating from the period of about 12,000 to 5,000 BC, typically had rounded or pointed bottoms so that they could easily be stuck into the ground or in ashes of a cooking fire. The pottery of this sort is the earliest pottery yet to be found in the world. Flat-bottom pots became common by the so-called early Jomon period, from about 5500 BC to 2500 BC, perhaps indicating that they were now used indoors on packed earthen floors rather than looser ashes or dirt. The middle Jomon, 3500 to 2500, and late Jomon, 2500 to about 1500 BC, typically had elaborate designs. By later Jomon, large stone jars were made, perhaps for infant burial and religious offerings, while carved stone and clay figures, known as dogu, became increasingly elaborate. Many of these looked like pregnant females, and hence were undoubtedly meant to pray for fertility and a good harvest. Stone fertility symbols have also been found. Unlike Neolithic humans in China, and other cultural centers, the Paleolithic and Jomon periods inhabitants of Japan subsisted primarily by hunting, fishing, and gathering rather than settled agriculture. They may have cultivated some millet and herbs, but most likely they simply knew where to find and gather edible plants and how to help preserve their food with salt. They also lived on nuts, fruits, roots, deer, wild boar, and were available seafood. Obsidian, a glass-like stone, was a prized material for arrowheads. In the early period, individual hunters prowled for game, but soon bands of hunters were formed. The dog, the only domesticated animal known to the Jomon Japanese, joined in the chase. The Jomon period typically lived in small villages of the Jomon period people, in 6 to 10 dwellings per village. The standard house was a pit scooped in the earth with a makeshift grass or brushwood roof, held up by 5 or 6 posts. and an interior central fireplace with stone slabs. Each dwelling was large enough to accommodate between 4 and 8 persons, and most settlements were at least semi-permanent. Most communities probably tried to be self-sufficient, but there were some local or regional exchange with, for example, salt from the coastal regions being traded for stone for tools and arrowheads from the mountains. In late Jomon communities, about 2000 to 1000 BC, there are house pits considerably larger than their neighbors. These may have been the homes of village chiefs or places of worship for one or more villages. Archaeologists have estimated the population of Jomon, Japan to be between 125,000 all the way up to 250,000 people, with the peak population around 5000 BC and then actually declining. Skeletal remains suggest that the adults were about 5 feet 6 inches tall, or quite high for human beings of this period. They decorated themselves with lacquered combs, bone hairpins, shell earrings, and other ornaments. Life expectancy was probably about 30 years, with death rates highest among those among the newborns and those over 40 years old. While some linguists have detected traces of Southeast Asian languages in modern Japanese speech, it seems likely that the language the Jomon people spoke was related mainly to Korean. Korean, Chinese, and other Altaic, in other words, Mongolian or Turkish languages. And by the end of this period, in some, the Jomon Japanese clearly had a complex community life. So that ends the Jomon period. And I think I'll continue for a little bit, because I always do enjoy videos that go a little bit longer than 30 minutes typically. So we'll go on for another 15 or so minutes. We have the third period here. I think finishing up through the pre-historic eras, before the year 0, before the modern era, I think would be a good place to continue through. Next, we have the Yayoi period from 900 BC to 250 AD. In 1884, some distinctive pottery, clearly different in style and technique from Jomon pots, was unearthed in the Yayoi district of modern Tokyo. This district gave its name to a relatively brief but decisive period of Japanese culture. So we have the Yayoi period from 900 100 BC to 250 AD. In 1884, some distinctive pottery, clearly different in style and technique from the Jomon pots, was unearthed in the Yeyo district of Tokyo. This district gave its name to a relatively brief but decisive period of Japanese culture in which the late Jomon culture was overlaid with a new and more advanced culture based not only on new pottery forms but also the mining, smelting, and casting of bronze and iron, and the irrigation of and cultivation of rice. Yeyo culture varied by region, but overall was a culture unique to Japan. It has been traditionally dated from 300 BC to 300 AD, but scholars now think that it developed from at least 8 or 900 BC. Rice cultivation was one characteristic of the period. Rice had been grown in the Yangtze River Basin in China from at least 5000 BC, and in Korea from about 1500 BC, but apparently did not reach Japan until about 300 AD, nearly 1,000 years, over 1,000 years later. Probably small groups of immigrants from the continent brought rice and cultivation techniques to Japan, where they and the Jomon peoples began to prepare special fields that had ample supplies of water and developed these necessary seeding, weeding, and harvesting skills. The earliest fields were natural wetlands, but gradually the Yeyo people learned to construct irrigation canals that could supply the right amount of water. To round out their diet, the Yeyo people also gathered wild plants, cultivated fruit, hunted, and fished, of course. The Yeyo people also saw the extensive use of metal, practical iron tools from Korea, such as axes and knives, had been found in the oldest Yeyo sites in the western part of Japan, and as I turn the page, even in a Jomon site from that same period in the northern island of Hokkaido. Ritual bronze objects such as mirrors, swords, spears also came from China and Korea. Eventually, the Yeyo people learned to mine, smelt, and produce these items on their own. One example of this local manufacturer was the bronze bell-shaped objects known as totaku. The idea for these objects may have come from the continent, but they quickly developed into a uniquely Japanese style. They appear to have symbolized divine spirits, and hence to have been used for religious fertility symbols. Yeyo pottery also reflected technological improvements. The pots were normally fired at higher temperatures, 850 degrees Celsius or over 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. That was much higher than Jomon pottery. Unlike Jomon pottery, though, the surfaces of these pots were generally smooth and geometric in shape. had geometric designs, rather. There were many different kinds of this pottery, ranging from cooking and storage pots to more formal vessels used for burial and religious purposes, but it was clear that all were made by quite sophisticated artisans. The Yao people looked rather like the inhabitants of Northeast Asia, and hence more closely resembled modern Japanese than did the more South China and Southeast Asia looking Jomon. Some of the differences may have been due to a better diet, but most likely the slow trickle of immigrants moving from the more northern areas of Asia through Korea to Japan greatly increased in this period. They lived in villages that were in many ways similar to those around the lower Yangtze River in China. As many as 30 households may have lived together at one time in houses that were oval in shape and over 48 square meters, or actually 1,500 plus square feet in size. It's always interesting how those two can vary when you talk about squaring the number. In America, we talk about square feet, so we don't. 48 square meters to me, compared to 1,500 square feet, seems like a small number, but it's interesting. These houses had roofs of thatched material that were supported by heavy beams and posts. The floors were set to the ground, but they were protected from flood damage by earthen walls. There was usually a hearth for cooking and warmth in the center. Cultivated rice and other foods could be stored in jars or in specially designed storehouses. Wooden fencing marked off their fields, some of which were larger than 400 square meters, or more than 4,300 square feet. Judging from implements found in the area, cultivation was done with stone reapers, wooden rakes, and hoes. As the population increased and more conflicts over land and water rights occurred, Yao village leaders gradually evolved into village chiefs. Villages coalesced into their chiefdoms, and fighting between chiefdoms became common. Of course, if they're not with you, they're against you. And if they are an out group, they are, I guess, just by ignorance, not with you, by lack of familiarity with each other. Doesn't take much to have a territory dispute when you have a finite number of resources and an especially finite, closed off island. I was gonna say sea surrounded, but ocean encompassed island, but that's pretty much the definition of an island, I suppose. So, by the last century of the Yao, around 150 to 250 AD, confederations of chiefdoms had developed into political bodies that ultimately laid the foundation for the ancient state. One of these confederations was a legendary nation known as the Yamatai Koku, or the country of Yamatai. Chinese records indicate that this nation was ruled over, nation they put in quotes there, at least religiously, by a priestess known as Himiko, literally the daughter of the sun. She is said to have sent an envoy to China in about 238 BC, and to have received a gift from China in return. Early chronicles suggest that she may have been the Empress Jingu, a powerful ruler who Japanese sources claim lived at the same time. The location of her capital of Yamatai is also unclear. Over 50 different sites in northern Kyushu and Kansai, and the Kansai, which is Osaka, Kyoto area on the main island of Honshu, have been suggested. While little is certain about both the capital and its rulers, in sum, it does not appear that Yeo Japan was gradually developing into a strong... it does appear that they were developing into a strong state. So... I think that's a perfectly nice place to go ahead and stop. So it's very interesting that Japan was colonized nearly 40,000 years ago, maybe even 60,000 years ago. I've never been to Asia. I would love to go, but it certainly seems like the landscapes over there in China and certain parts of Japan in particular are extremely beautiful, and they sound so nice. Just lush, green, mountainous, with streams and beautiful flowers and trees, and I'm sure people. And I would love to ultimately go in those ocean cliffs and watching that sunrise out of the ocean, like I have the privilege of doing if I ever wake up that early. But especially after the language tree episode, I'm just growing. My interests are growing, especially in Asian culture. There's so much, and there's plenty in Western civilization for me yet to learn. But I figure, why not try to learn about a culture or a civilization, I guess, a conglomeration of cultures in East Asia here that I know really very, very, very little about. So I'll leave you guys there. Until next time, sleep well.